Thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. We are excited to have you join us for today's webinar, Developing and Optimizing Your Applied Epic Workflows. My name is Lauren Roberts, and I'm the Chief Agency Consultant here at Kite Technology Group. I'm joined by Agency Consultant Jenny Honican. We are glad you're joining us today and are excited to be sharing today's content. Kite Technology Group is a managed IT service provider and agency consulting firm that works with independent insurance agencies and businesses across the country. With 30 years of experience and many more, and a team that knows the insurance industry firsthand, we help agencies get more from their technology and applied Epic systems. You'll see some of our key services listed here, and if you'd like to learn more, please just send us a message through the Q&A panel and we'll reach out after today's session. So we're going to go ahead and get introductions out of the way because we have a lot of content to cover today, of course, as usual. So I am Lauren Roberts, the Chief Agency Consultant, as I mentioned earlier. I have lots and lots of experience in the insurance industry, many years, too many to count at this point. And I work with our clients on lots of different types of projects, applied Epic migrations from many different systems, as well as some of the accounting stuff that our agencies need. Not all of our consultants like those things. I'm kind of a nerd as far as that's concerned. And then I also like to help our agencies who are looking to optimize their use of Epic, as well as training, developing workflows, and many other things that we work on here, as well as leading a wonderful team of consultants, of whom Jenny is one of those. So Jenny, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll get started on the agenda.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny Honican. I'm an agency consultant with Kite Technology and just hit my 3-year Kite anniversary. So I've been doing this for 3 years. And of course, I've been on Epic years before that. But I mostly focus on the servicing side. I do dabble in the accounting from time to time, but just enough to be dangerous. I'll leave that to Lauren. But I will help with optimizations and workflows and reports and just getting into dashboards, things like that. I'm kind of the data nerd on the team.
She definitely is. I like to call her a reports queen. So as you guys have questions today, remember she's the reports queen. Uh, all right, so let's go ahead and talk about what we will be covering today. We will be going over the importance of establishing your standardized workflows, as well as the difference between workflows and procedures. We'll talk about some key information and instructions that you should be including in those workflows as well. We'll talk about a couple of options for designing your workflows and some of the tools that we recommend and some of the ones that we use as well. And of course, we have to talk about how we're going to implement, train, and audit those workflows, because if you're going to put in all of that effort, you want to make sure that we've got some follow through there. So first, let's talk about why standardizing your workflows is going to be important. So as we talk through creating these workflows, some of the things that you want to consider and reasons why you need to standardize those workflows are, of course, things like consistency. You want to consider the fact that as you've got different workflows that are being performed throughout the agency, if everybody's doing them a different way, it's going to be really hard to kind of follow behind folks, make sure that we've got data integrity, data quality as well, because if we don't know, which workflow someone's following, because there are some options, as far as that's concerned, we won't be able to really accurately identify the data that we're looking to get out of the system. We also want to make sure that you are creating efficiency in your agency. So there's a lot of ways that you can integrate some best practices into workflows to minimize some of the clicks and things that are in the system. Consider things like the configuration. We'll be talking about that as well, and how that's going to have an impact on your workflows and what your users are experiencing on the front end. And then, of course, onboarding and training. So, I'm sure everybody's been in a situation where we need to train after someone has left, and it's kind of hard to follow behind that person if we didn't have those standardized workflows. So it's really important to establish that standardization so that when you do have to replace an employee for whatever reason, it's very easy for them to just pick up that book and move along and be able to work efficiently and create accuracy as well. So we also like to talk through the things like what is a workflow versus what is a procedure. So there is actually a difference as far as we're concerned. Some folks might call them the same things, but when we talk about a workflow, what we're really looking at is the specific task. So what is the button you need to click? What is the activity that you need to use? What is the process that you're following in the system itself? So this is really the nitty gritty, the how to actually process these things in the Applied Epic system. When it comes to a procedure, though, that may be something that's more along the lines of, how many months in advance is our standard for starting that pre-renewal process? Are we starting that at 90 days for personal lines and 120 days for commercial lines? Whatever the case is, that's going to be your internal standard that you're going to ensure that gets followed while you're processing that workflow in the Applied Epic system. And of course, they go hand in hand. We do have a lot of agencies who like to add some procedural details into the workflows itself. Sometimes, just want to consider the fact that that can really make it a little bit longer workflow. So when we're expecting users to learn and understand these things, you may want to separate things out into, maybe a procedure is more of a cheat sheet, and your workflow is, again, that here's the how to, your screenshots, and all of those items. So Jenny, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about some of the key information that we really should be including in these workflows.
Yeah, we need to consider some things when we're talking about workflows before you even write the first step down. Think about why you're creating these workflows. First they should create efficiency. There are several different ways to do things in Epic, just like there's several different ways to do things in Microsoft or what have you. But there's typically a best practice, and one that comes to mind is when you are issuing a policy, there's that extra tab where you can close open activities. So using the system to the best of its ability to make yourself more efficient, rather than close the activity there, rather than going to the activity screen and closing it out, or going over spending time going out to a carrier website, that kind of thing. You just want to be as efficient as possible, and not waste time doing things that could be right there with you. You want to make your workflows just clear enough that everybody can understand and follow them. And we'll show you some examples that we like to use in a minute. But you don't want to get overly technical with a lot of these workflows. You want to make them. We really like bulleted points and numbered lists, that kind of thing, screenshots. That's uh, that's very nice. But you want it to be very clear that everyone's following them, and again, everyone's doing them the exact same way. The idea is you want to be able to go behind anybody. You want to be able to find information in Epic 2 years later. And you want to, if everybody's doing it the same way, then that makes it a lot easier. Your workflows and procedures should help protect your agency from errors and omissions. So things like documenting everything. We say this all the time. If it's not an Epic, it didn't happen. Document everything. Put it all in the same place every time, so it's easily accessible. There's never a question about who called and asked for that endorsement, or who emailed and added a driver to this policy, that kind of thing. You just want to make sure that you're protecting yourself. Then also you want to have your workflows drive the accurate data entry. That's going to drive your accurate reporting. So if you think about, you always want to have your policy statuses updated. You always want to have your policies issued. You want your data to be the same across departments, across branches, just across the whole agency. You want everybody entering data, entering the same fields, using the same fields, because you're going to be running reports off of that data, and you just want to make that as smooth as possible. Something else to consider, just kind of in this point, we have a little note here: reports versus dashboards. Is think about how that data is being pulled into an Epic report versus into a dashboard. Epic reports are typically based on policy status, and so you want your policy statuses to be updated and accurate. Epic dashboards really use that service summary row, so you want those issued. You want the service summary row action to be new or renewed, depending on what kind of business it is. So you want to take that into consideration as well. And you don't want to forget to include different workflows for different departments. Like we said, as far as you can, you want everything to be as similar as possible. But sometimes personal lines and commercial lines do things differently. And so when you're considering your workflows, think about how they might diverge and how you can get the data in the same as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, we know that a lot of times our personal lines folks are going to lean very heavily on things like the download. So,
Mhm.
whereas commercial lines may want to put a little bit more detail and data into those applications themselves. So, very good point there.
Yeah.
And Jenny, I'm glad you pointed out the E&O because that is definitely one thing that should be really important to our insurance agencies because, hey, we do sell this stuff too, right? So, all right, very good. So let's see what we have next here.
Yeah. So some other things to considering, some things to keep in mind. Adapting what you used to do or what you did before Epic, that's not going to give you the full advantage of applied Epic efficiencies. And especially if you came from TAM to Epic, it's the same company, but they're completely different systems. And so we always say don't Tamify Epic. If you came from paper files, then of course Epic is going to give you so much more efficiencies and things like that. So really, just let go of the past and let go of how you used to do it. I always say it's like getting switching from Android to iPhone or getting a new car. It's going to be clunky and awkward at first, but there's so many cool features in Epic that you can use. So you want to be able to take full advantage of that.
I
Um,
feel like I should need to break out into the Let It Go song right now, but keep going.
Courtney's an amazing singer, so that would not be a bad thing. Um, yeah, so you want to identify issues with data and or efficiency. So who's missing, who's behind, and when you have these workflows in place, and we'll get into auditing and checking up on that later as well. You'll be able to see maybe who's struggling, who needs a little bit more attention, and who needs a little bit more retraining in the system, that kind of thing. So yeah, identify who might be struggling with the new system. One of the things that we preach is consider using one or very minimal one activity code per workflow. So if you renew a policy, have a renewal activity, whether you have put it on had a report, put it on the expiring term, or if you are renewing the policy in Epic and using that renewal activity, or if the download renews the policy for you and you're using that, just use that one activity. All your notes, all of your attachments right there, put them in that one bucket, as Lauren likes to say. She likes to call it a bucket. And keep it all right there. That way you can use that efficiency of that access button. So you're on your policy and you can access activities, and then you can see your renewal activity, all your notes are right there, all your attachments are right there. So yeah, definitely Epic will give you a bunch of activities. Let's just make it easier on yourself and just use one or very few. And
Yeah,
then,
definitely.
uh-huh.
It definitely becomes hard, if you're thinking about the various activities and again, like you said, utilizing the access button. Which activity am I supposed to look on to figure out where this information is? And if we're like you said, just using that one, it's going to tell the story. It's got the supporting documentation right there. It's going to make that a lot easier and more streamlined to find that information in your system.
Yeah, especially if you're going back years later and you're trying to figure out what happened. If you are in the habit of using that attachment activity or a call or follow-up activity, those they don't really help you find that information quickly. So if you keep them all on that workflow activity, you can find that workflow, all your notes are there, and it's so much easier to find. And along those lines, you want to identify your preferred method for attaching documentation in Epic. We will say all day, every day, attached to the workflow activity. Some agencies like to attach to the policy. You still have some use of that access feature there, but attaching it to the account is it's not gonna help you filter your activities and your attachments and transactions and things. Um, in the system. So uh, as you get along in Epic, you're just going to have so many attachments and so many activities that it's easier to keep them compartmentalized. Kind of like if you have a hanging file folder back in the days of filing cabinets, like 10 years ago, you have a hanging file folder, and then you have the folders within the folder. Just to think about your activities kind of that way. You've got your client account, and then you've got your workflows within it, or your policy terms, that kind of thing.
I love that analogy. That's great. And was it 10 years ago or like more? I don't know.
I don't know. I feel like I was still using file folders 10 years ago. So
Right? I think I probably was too. Yeah, now that you think about it.
yeah, yeah. So when you get together and you talk about, okay, we've got to have workflows. We've all been there. Who do you include? Who do you include in your workflow discussion? Oh, there's a couple of questions. I'm going to pause over here because Paul is asking what would be considered a workflow, the entire renewal process up to policy issuance. And yes, we would call the renewal process a workflow. And here's how you do it in Epic, and here's who does what, and the buttons that you click, that kind of thing. Um, and then yeah, and then David is asking about claims activities, which attach to either the claim or the policy, but not both. The claim should be attached to the policy. Is it not? It should be attached to when you associate it to the policy.
Yeah, that's
Um,
one of those ones. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Good point.
yeah,
Good point, David. You should put in a bright idea for that because it would be great if it would attach where we need it
oh,
to attach.
yeah.
Claims are one of those unique situations, though. Good point.
I haven't
And
dug
it's,
a whole lot into claims, so yeah,
yeah, yeah. All right, cool.
yeah.
Let's talk about who we
So
want to include in this conversation
yeah.
because we don't want to have, too many irons in the fire, too many people in this discussion. Really want to focus that in, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So you want to include a representative from each department. You want your personal lines people, you want your commercial lines people. Like Lauren said, your personal lines people rely heavily on download. If you have benefits, that's a whole different animal. And if you're like me, I came from the crop insurance world. So if you have crop or farm or something like that, you want everybody's input, because if you're trying to make everybody do things as similar as possible, then you need to hear from all of the sides. So if you have like tasks to specific people when you're configuring activities, you might have to have more than one activity code associated to that event. If you have different owners, things like that, you just want to make sure that everybody's covered and that everybody's voice is heard. Definitely need management involved. You want management buy-in, because you want to have people, uh, you want to have the management behind you so that they can gather the team together and hold everyone accountable. This is how we're going to do this, kind of beat the drum for that. But you also need the people with the hands-on working knowledge. So management knows what reports they need, and then also can hold them accountable. The CSRs are going to have that day-to-day experience with the work, how the workflow is going to affect them. So that's going to be uh, essential. Danielle, you are asking about personal lines and commercial lines following the same workflows. Very similar. I do advocate for that. We usually create workflows for if the policy downloads versus if it doesn't. And a lot of times those can be for personal lines or commercial lines. And then also, if you're using the marketing module, which is mostly commercial lines, we usually have a different workflow for that as well.
Yeah,
Um,
and we're going to get into that actually a little bit here. I think our
yeah.
our wonderful audience has intuitively thought about our next slides. So
Yeah, the last point on the last slide was, identify, you choose wisely. You want to have people that are excited about using Epic. You don't want to necessarily pull in the person that's kicking and screaming, and you don't want to make everyone's lives miserable by forcing them to change and be a part of this. You want to hear from the people that are the change makers and the implementers.
yeah, and kind of to piggyback off of that, I have seen before where agencies may have thought, well, if I get this person to be involved in this conversation, maybe they'll buy into Epic or they'll buy into the new processes and procedures. But that's typically not the way it's going to work. So you definitely
Mhm.
want to find your cheerleaders, those folks that are really engaged in in making the changes and bettering your agency overall.
Mhm.
Yeah. So as Jenny was saying earlier, you want to also identify the workflows that are needed. And so, like she was saying, there are definitely going to be some key main workflows that you may end up having to split out based on the type of workflow itself. So, you're going to have things like a new business workflow. And you may have a simple new business workflow. We're just going to go to this one carrier because we know who this is. So we've got kind of a simplified process there. And it's going to look a little bit differently for commercial lines and personal lines, especially depending on, what tools you're using. Consider whether or not you're using Epic Quotes, or, your commercial lines folks may need to go into the marketing module. So you want to consider things like that and identify those as you're thinking through something like a new business workflow. What are the scenarios that we need to ensure that we have established, and write those workflows out depending on what that scenario is going to be. Same thing for something like your renewals. You're probably, like Jenny said, you're going to treat something like a downloaded renewal a little bit differently, probably from your regular manual renewals. Endorsements, though, may be very similar for personal lines and commercial lines. So you may not need to split that one out. Maybe, again, something like download versus non-download, but you may not have the same, or you may not need to have two separate workflows for personal and commercial. Now, that's not to say that some agencies don't like to still write it out as two separate workflows just to provide that clarity. Like, here's all of commercial lines, there's your workflows, have a nice day. And then here's personal lines, whether it looks the same or not, these are yours. It just kind of gives that ownership over those two. So you may be doing a little copying and pasting, but ultimately they may be very similar in nature. Transacting is another workflow that may be very similar as well. Cancellations, issuing auto IDs, that's not going to change from commercial to personal. Now if you're issuing a whole fleet of auto IDs, that's going to be a little bit different. But those are, some of the additional primary workflows. These are going to be a little bit more straightforward. You're not going to have a lot of different scenarios that you're going to need to consider, other than, is there a difference in how we're going to handle this for download, or for personal or commercial, if there's going to be any difference in the two there. You may have some procedural aspects that are a little bit different when it comes to something like personal or commercial. If it's just a monoline auto policy that's canceling for a personal lines client, you may not do as much follow-up or things like that as you would if it was a very large business auto policy and you want to do some additional follow-up, maybe set out an X date for next year and remarket that client in the future. So those are those procedural details that may be a little bit different from one department to another, but the workflow itself, actions, cancel, pick the activity, put the information in, all of that stuff is going to be pretty similar from one department to the next.
And you're going to have different workflows for if they cancel midterm versus at renewal versus you've rewritten the policy as well. So even,
Exactly.
just across departments, everybody's kind of doing that.
Absolutely. And so, like we said, you may want to consider combining some of those workflows, unless the departments have different procedures that need to be documented. Here's a nice little example. You may want to actually combine a workflow instead of writing one out that's non-download and download. You could do that as well. It's really going to be about how well your staff understands the system and how well they're going to pick up on these things, and can they understand? Do they really need? Do you get some feedback that they want, or your group that is getting this done? Do they want to have those two separate processes, or can we just put a little step in that says, hey, if this policy is downloaded, just skip down to like step number 10 and keep your process going. So, that's again where it's really important to have your core group, your SMEs, your subject matter experts involved to put that input in and identify whether or not that's going to work best for your agency. And of course, make sure the workflow is going to work for all departments. Please do not go out and create a workflow for commercial lines and change all of these things thinking that personal lines will be fine. We got to make sure that everybody has their workflows and it works for everyone. I've definitely seen that happen before where somebody made a change to something like a system event activity, and then next thing you know, personal lines is like, oh my gosh, what's going on over here? Because now we can't get this activity, or we've got the wrong activity. So you don't want to ruffle all the feathers in this process. It's okay to make mistakes, but at the same time, try to be preventative about that and planning in your processes, and make sure that you are engaging with both departments and not creating problems for another. Don't forget about your benefits people either. So I know we've said personal and commercial so much now. I'm like, am I forgetting the benefits people? They have fancy tools though, like benefits designer. So another thing to consider is going to be the configuration. So here you want to think about what is the configuration and how is this going to impact the workflow itself. You need to understand things like your system events. Those are the things that when you click something in Epic, it's going to either give you an activity or not give you an activity. And then what is that activity configuration? And do we want tasks to be created from that? Don't get out of control with the tasks, by the way.
Mhm.
They're a cool thing to use for a to-do list, but not when there's 40 of them. Um, just being honest, right, Jenny?
That's right. That's right.
Another thing to consider is if you have been on Epic for a while, you need to look at what the updates are that have happened over time. So consider going back and looking at some of those release notes. Always good to check out your forums to see, are there some cool new things? Applied Client Network is a great resource as well, or your handy dandy kite consultants to see, are there some things that have been updated that maybe you're not taking advantage of. There's some really neat features in areas like interface that you can split out things by department or profit center structure, things like that. Another thing to consider when you're making any of these changes in your configuration is that you want to document everything. All too often, I've seen where somebody's made a change to the configuration and nobody has any reason or understanding why. Why do we have this activity? Who's using this and what are they using it for? So think about things like that too. It's really a great idea to create like a spreadsheet or a workbook that says, here's what our current configuration is. Here's what we changed and here's why we changed it. Here's why we inactivated these activities because we're not using them or whatever the case is. Maybe they're Canadian, who knows? So some of that
Yeah. Hey,
configuration.
Lauren, Jenna.
Yes.
Oh, Jenna's asking, what's a good way to monitor the configuration changes? Like when commercial changes something personal didn't know about?
Oh,
And
trust me, you'll know.
you'll know. I mean, you can't tell who made the change and when it was made. But some of the dashboards are starting to give you a little bit more like in security settings, the
Mhm.
security updates that are done. But as far as activity configuration, but I would just say you should not have so many enterprise admins that anybody can just go in and update configuration. It should always be a discussion. You need to like talk about the implications for all of the departments, and that's where that workbook comes in handy, like the documentation of why and that kind of thing.
Mhm. Absolutely. We do have a couple other questions that we might as well go ahead and jump in and answer. So we have one from Hitesh that is, with the complexity of commercial lines, multi-policy accounts, claims activities, client texting, how can agencies leverage Epic's configuration options while maintaining standard workflows for data integrity, compliance, and team efficiency? I would say that we're going to talk about auditing when we get towards the end a little bit further. But there's definitely, different reports that you're going to want to use. There's some auditing that we'll talk about as well. And there is a fantastic webinar that we just did not too long ago on how to audit your staff and those standardized workflows. So, but yes, we will get to that one in just a little bit later.
Mhm.
Great question from Kimberly. Where can the release notes be found? There's two places now, actually. So if you're using the browser, you can access those from the notification spot that's up on the right-hand corner, Jenny.
It's like the resource center up in the top corner next to your logout button.
Mhm.
You'll see all kinds of little step by steps and things like that. But the release notes is like the second. There's announcements, so that'll give you like the newest stuff, and then you can actually read the release notes there.
Yes, and they can also be found in the applied community. Is that correct?
Yes,
Your
yes,
login.
they're in the applied community as well. Yeah, yeah.
Excellent. Okay. And examples of how to document changes. Kimberly has another great idea or question. I am going to hold off on that and let Jenny go find a sample of a workbook while I am continuing to go
Yep.
through this presentation, and we'll jump over to that before we get too far in.
Yep.
Right. You're good,
Figure
Jenna.
out
We got
one.
you. All right, and then we have a couple other questions we'll answer while we're here on this slide. We have a question from Raina. The department managers usually get together since the changes in Epic are global. That is a fantastic idea, absolutely. Anytime you see those, changes that are being made or you're going to make those changes, definitely a good idea to involve your department managers. Make sure that you're meeting regularly to discuss those things. And as we talk through the planning process, and you're going to have your subject matter experts, another thing that we recommend is once you've made a change to those workflows, check back in with your staff. You don't know what you don't know if they don't tell you. So it's great to have meetings and talk to the staff and say, hey, how's this going? Are you having any issues? Because there may be something that you've made a change to that doesn't work for everybody, and that's perfectly fine. But if it is something that you made a change to because you wanted a specific outcome and it does make sense, it's just something that's taken a little bit longer for everybody to get used to, hold firm on that as well. So make sure you're considering those different situations.
I'm going
All
to take
right.
over for a second, if that's all right, Lauren.
Yes, go right ahead, ma'am.
Awesome. Awesome. So this is the workbook that we use, and here we download, or you can print to CSV, all of the activity codes and descriptions. We put notes about how we're using this, that kind of thing. The blue section, we do the event, how the system event is behaving. And so we usually say, if it's a system generated event versus user generated right here, what workflow or area it might have to do with. This is if it's generating automatically, yes, no, or yes or no, or not applicable in the case of a user generated event. If it's required, not required, or background. And then the green part is how we document the activity code itself. So we use some color coding in this. Yellows are things that we suggest, changes that we suggest to make. Green are changes that we've already made, and you could put notes in here as well. Red are things that activity codes that we intend on inactivating, and then we will come over here and put those on the inactivated list once that's done. So that's just an example of what we use. You'll see in your database when we're talking about release notes and updates that you'll have some that are would have this at code in front of them, and those are updates that have come from applied, new features, things like that that mean that you haven't configured those in your system. So when you go to configure those, it won't let you keep that at symbol. That's just a good visual to tell you that you need to configure that one. Fun fact, this one, you guys all have this at out. And according to the last meeting that we had with Applied, this new Outlook add-in is going to be released in August, and we'll be able to configure that. It's with new Outlook, so that'll be fun.
So let me just finish typing this last question or answer here. Good question from Christy. I'll just point it out to the rest of our group here. She says, is there a good report to basically find activities that haven't been used? Not necessarily that haven't been used specifically. So typically the way I go at that is to identify activities that I'm not really familiar with. So as I'm looking through, if it's like a manual activity that's not tied out to an event, you can do an activity analysis report and just generate the summary part of that. Look at, basically the date entered for that specific activity over the last 12 months. And if it hasn't been used in 12 months, chances are it's got to go bye-bye. So, or if it's something that's used far too often and you're like, wait, people shouldn't be using this activity. That's another way to find some of that information. Because if you run an activity report for like everything over the last 12 months, you're just going to like crash Epic. So just keep that in mind. All right. So,
And keep in mind,
oh,
if you're not using an activity, it may be tied to a system event that you just haven't used. For instance, like if you're not issuing a binder out of Epic, there's an activity that goes with that. Don't inactivate that one. Keep it just in case somebody ever does issue a binder out of Epic. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I would keep them attached to the system events.
Yes. And so we're not going to go through exactly how to configure all of these things because that would take us a few more hours today. But these are several of the basics in configure that we would want to ensure we're reviewing as a part of developing the workflows, the things to consider as you are entering information in those workflows as well. And how do you want folks to use these different features? So think about your system events, what's going to generate an activity, does it need to? And then also what manual activities you want to use, and you can group those into activity categories based on things like the department or the workflow. Activity defaults. Do you want this activity to pop up and open and kind of tell somebody, hey, you should be following up on this activity because it defaulted to open? Or do you want it to close? So it pops up and you want them to make a note, but it closes so they don't have that extra click. You can kind of configure these things so that it's more intuitive and your users can say, oh, that defaulted to open, this is a follow-up activity, right? I knew Keith was going to ask that at some point. Unfortunately, we cannot share that Excel spreadsheet because it is proprietary. But if you're one of our clients, we would be happy to create one for you. Uh, so our policy statuses are another really important part of that process, especially for things like reporting, like Jenny mentioned earlier. There's lots of reports in Epic that are going to be based on those policy statuses. And so really important to configure those based on things like your active business, lost business, or maybe things we just want to exclude from different reports like entered an error. Renewals manager, if you're not using it, you should, just like the Epic browser. And so you want to make sure that you configure the renewals manager to work kind of for everybody. We do have a webinar out on our YouTube and resources page for that as well. Things like your interface options, your download configuration. That's what I mentioned earlier. There are a lot of cool new features. I say new, but they've been out for like a couple of years now. So you can configure things based on the department. You're not stuck doing all the same thing anymore like we used to be. User options is another area where you can create some efficiency for your staff. Things like what our field defaults are that are going to pop in. So I don't have to think about it. It just generates for me. Other things would be required desired fields. Required desired fields can definitely help you with making sure that you get the data fields completed that need to be completed, but tread lightly, especially when it comes to different departments. Something that needs to be entered for PNC may not be applicable to benefits. Agency commission percent is one of the big ones that I always tread lightly on because benefits is a whole different monster when it comes to commissions and things like that. So I would require it for PNC, maybe not so much for our benefits folks. Maybe they get more of the flat rate or whatever the case is. All right, so jumping right along, we did talk about the events in a little bit of detail. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because we could go all day on your system generated events. And looking at our slides, we still have quite a few to get through in 20 minutes. So remember, an event is an action in Epic. It's something that you are going to do in Epic, and it, like I said, could give you an activity or not. This is where you want to consider things like that renewal process that Jenny mentioned earlier. Do we want an activity to generate for a renewal? Obviously. And is that the activity that we're going to use throughout that renewal process? You can also create multiple options for your users. So I'm going to switch over to this next slide so you can see what that screen looks like. There may be instances where you need to have multiple options. A cancellation, for example, you could have a cancel for non-pay, or you could just have a regular old cancellation you just want to pull the service summary row into. Cancel for non-pay, it's canceled, it's done, right? We don't have to follow up on that. So that's why we have two different activities for that. Whereas the cancel policy activity is going to open and we're going to make sure that we follow up on that. Other things, though, that may not need an activity to generate and pop up would be something like an add attachment. We may want to report on that and see how many folks are attaching to the policy or account. I like to call that my tattletale activity, ATCH. So if you background that activity, you can see, oh, Susie's attaching everything to the account or the policy, and we really want her to be attaching to that workflow activity. So consider some of those items and whether or not the user actually needs to do something with the activity or if you just want it in the background for reporting. Also note that there are several that are Canadian events that we don't actually do in the US. So if you're in Canada, great, those totally are going to apply to you. But if you are in the US, you don't actually need to configure those specific activities. And you can always reach out to us as our consulting team, or you can also contact Applied to identify what those activities are. It's kind of one of those, if you don't see it, hear it, it's just let it go. But if you wanted to shorten your activity list, you can get rid of some of those if needed. Okay, so we also have things like considering whether it's an event or manual driven activity. So workflow in Epic is, we start a process and it gives us an activity, or it could be a workflow that doesn't have an action in Epic. We have the actions, cancel, actions, renew, things like that. But something like a non-renewal, there is no actions non-renew. I get a non-renewal notice. I need a non-renewal activity. So those are those items where you're going to consider, I need a manual activity versus having an event that's going to give that activity to my user. This is something that we definitely want to make sure we point out that you don't want to overdo those, right? So consider a manual activity as something that is unique. It's not something that's going to give you the ability to use a system generated activity, but try not to go overboard with those, because the fewer options you have for your staff, the more likely they are to choose the right one. But you also, don't want to get too generic. It's a really delicate balance here. You're like, Lauren, what am I supposed to do? Just be careful. So I like to think about, is this something that happens often, right? A non-renewal, obviously that happens often. Or is this something that's just kind of a one-off and I don't need to have a specific activity for this just because somebody says, hey, I don't have an activity for this, right? So be very cautious when your users are saying, hey, I don't have an activity for this. Question that and say, but could that go, is that like part of the renewal process and you just want to put that somewhere else? You kind of have to remind your users when you're creating these workflows and these configurations, where that information should actually go. All right, we put a lot of information in this area as well on the activity defaults. Jenny, in order to eliminate the fact that my voice might give out, I'm going to pass the activity defaults to you, and I
Sure.
will keep skipping through the slides.
Sure, sure. So you can configure some defaults in the activity, and the idea is, with user field defaults, activity defaults, all of these things, you're going to have people. You want your people to think about insurance and not about how do I do this in Epic. So we're trying to funnel them through and have as much enter for them as possible. So you can set up, the default who owner. If this should always go to the account manager, then make that owner as the account manager. If it's always the user, make that owner the user. Configure your follow-up days. So right now, this change activity, it's set to follow up 3 days after entered. Well, if I'm in personal lines and I just go in and I enter this endorsement on the carrier website and they give me the endorsement immediately, I don't need to follow up 3 days from today. I can set that to 0 days today or maybe tomorrow to get that final document. You want to default your activity as open or closed. So if your activity is something that you're going to be following up on over a period of time, like a renewal activity, you keep that open through the whole process. You want that to default to open. If it's something that you're just making a note on, then you want to default that one to close. So just think about how your activity should be behaving. Use your tasks minimally. You can guide a workflow, and then there is further actions. I've never seen them work the way that I wanted them to work, but there are further actions, so you can have it generate another activity or send an email, that kind of thing. Keep in mind you've got background activities and hidden activities. So a background activity is actually on the event, and that is whether or not do you see that box pop up. So that some of these activities are just kind of stealthy. They add in the background. That's great. The new dashboards have work efforts, so that tallies in your work efforts. So that's really cool. But you do have to have a default owner. It has to be default to opened or closed. And one default activity as well, as opposed to a hidden activity, and that's configured on the activity itself. And that is whether or not you see it in the activity list on the client screen. And there is a drop down in the search where button where you can say show hidden activities, but for the most part, they'll be hidden for you, unless you add that search there. So you can put them in the background and hide them, or you can put them in the background and not hide them.
And here's just a little screenshot of that as well.
Yeah.
One thing I like to note is I don't like to use not required. I mean, some people might, but if I've gone to the effort to configure the activity and configure the event and put it in a workflow, I kind of want somebody to do something with that activity. So when you not require it, you're giving the user the option to just close that out. And now you've lost whatever that documentation was that you wanted them to use that activity for.
Mhm.
All right. And we also have a
Oh,
filter.
there's
Oh,
your
we
search where.
pointed this out as well. If you do hide activities specifically, you can also go into your activities list. When you do access activities, it's going to show those hidden activities by default. But if you're just looking in your entire activities list and you just want to see those hidden ones, you can search for only those hidden activities.
And we hide things like issue policy, things that you're not really using.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's your further action screen as well. So you can
Yes.
leave the
And
activity. They default to leave activity open, but you can do all these, send an SMS and send a letter, that kind of thing. Or have it automatically close after a certain number of days.
yeah, and one thing to keep in mind with the further actions is if you do have an action that is going to generate as a part of your configuration here, if someone closes that activity, the further action will not happen. So you could consider something like, let's say it's a cancel for non-pay notice, and you want an additional notification to go out, 3 days after you notify the client the first time. You could actually set that up so that it goes out 3 days after. But if you check on that, and you see, oh, the client has actually paid that already, you could go ahead and close it and they won't get that additional notification. That's one of the simplest, versions of further actions that I have been able to kind of create. But there are certainly, you can get a little creative with it. This is one of those areas where you can create a little bit of automation, but you want to consider, do I need to use a further action, or should I just use a report and the report's marketing, or something like your marketing automation as well?
We
Ooh,
spend a
those
lot of time,
tasks.
yeah, we spend a lot of time on activities, but those really drive your workflow. They're probably the most important configuration that you can do as far as workflows go.
Absolutely. And like we mentioned earlier, tasks can be a to-do list, right? So if we want to remind users, hey, always make sure you attach an invoice, or always make sure you check this policy, or whatever the case is, these are kind of a to-do list within the activity itself. But you want to be very cautious about adding too many tasks, because that is going to create additional items that your user is going to have to touch and remember to do in the system. If it's something that they should just kind of know to do as a part of a procedure, you may consider putting that in, an outside checklist or a procedure manual versus having that be an actual task. Now, if it's something that you're having a hard time getting anybody to remember at all, that's when I like to use a task, maybe one or two. Something like, think about your adding an agency bill invoice activity that's going to go over to accounting. Well, I want you to attach the invoice too, so make sure that you mark this task that you've attached the invoice itself. So that may be a way to kind of think about those tasks, but we definitely don't want to overcomplicate it. So just be careful about how many of those that you're adding, and don't forget the who owner is really important in those tasks as well. Here's just a little example of the activity categories that we mentioned earlier as well. And here is where you kind of have a couple of different options for how you could configure those categories. This is where you can make a list that is specific to a department, for their activities that they're going to use that are manual activities. So instead of pulling up that list and getting 385 activities, we just have a short list. But you can also filter it to the workflow itself, because there is a filter over in your activities list that you could sort to just where are my renewal workflow activities or just my new policy workflow activities. And I know we kind of touched on this one earlier, so I won't go in too much into policy statuses, renewals manager, user options, those things, because we talked about that in the first slide where we made bullets on those. Sorry, guys, I like to skip ahead sometimes. I think it's because I already know what's in the webinar later. All right, Jenny, so I'm going to pass it back to you because we've had lots of questions about workflow and the design considerations that we should be
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah, yeah. So we use several different options here. We use flowcharts sometimes, so there's some really good. We'll give you recommendations in a little bit. But you can just have like the simplified, do this, then do this, and you have the little decision tree, things like that. And that's really good if your people are already familiar with Epic and they don't need like a super detailed workflow, just that bullet point on one page of, I want to hit all the high points. Then we do detailed step-by-step workflows. And this is really good if employees are new to Epic, new hires, that kind of stuff. It can be overwhelming if you have people that are in Epic all the time, but we actually like to put in not only detailed step by step one, and then here's all the things that you do in step one, or all the fields that you need to address in here, and then we put a screenshot in there as well. So some of these workflows they're very detailed, and our whole workflow manual is over 200 pages. It's very detailed in there. You could record video workflow. So this is really great. We're always laughing about TikTok. We need to make a TikTok on how to do this or whatever. But you could create a quick little video, that kind of thing. But the challenge is if there's updates, with the new system updates and the browser is updated monthly, different changes are made, then you'd have to re-record your videos, or you could do a little bit of both, a little bit of all three. So those are the main ones that we use.
All right, into the nitty gritties. So we
Yeah.
only have a couple of examples, but definitely some additional tools that we could recommend.
Yeah. So here this is what our flow chart looks like, and it's just literally step by step by step. And we use a program called Lucid app to keep that. It saves them in there. Sheila, you said it seems like so much work. It is a lot of work to maintain a workflow. And the thing is, you have to always review it and make sure, with the updates, not just with the videos, but it's sometimes easier to update a Word document there. But we usually use Word. There's some other programs too that you can use. Yeah, so here's our flow chart sample. I think this is what our detailed one looks like. So we start off with your main workflow activity and the documentation standards that, what goes onto that activity. And then here's the the screenshots with the details in there. We
Yeah.
highlight and things like that.
Yeah, and some of the things you want to consider to include, this is a perfect example, as is, going back to the flow chart itself. Some of the information you want to make sure you get into these workflows are things like what type of activity are we using? Where are we putting documentation in? What type of attachments might be included? Policy statuses are going to be really important as well. So, that's why I love this detailed workflow, because it kind of gives you that little snapshot at the beginning and says, here's some of the key points that you're going to need to remember through this workflow. And then we've got the step-by-step in addition to those screenshots. Sheila, yes, you are correct. It is. But
It's painful but necessary. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And Carla has some additional, well, let me back up real quick. So we had some questions earlier about how do we maintain this information? Where do we put this information as well? If you are not on Microsoft 365 and have SharePoint, totally recommend that, because you can have, a whole basically website for your staff to go and check out their workflows, any types of forms that they may need to have, procedures, whatever the case is. And they can have access to that. But you can also, through Microsoft SharePoint, and feel free to go check out some of those Office 365 videos that we have out there that are far more technical than what I'm telling you now. Don't ask me to get into the technical part of that, but you can limit users' ability to edit documents there. So whether it was a Word document, which typically we would say create it in Word, but drop it into PDF so that it's just simpler for them. You don't have to worry about any edits, but you can also limit the ability to edit documents that are in SharePoint as well, based on the user structure and things like that. So, and then as far as maintaining those updated documents, Word, like Jenny said, is great. Lucid Chart, I'm going to pop over into some of our tools that we use. Lucid Chart is great. I know Carla mentioned Visio and Microsoft 365. Visio is a little over my head. I'm not gonna lie. I know some folks that are technical love to use Visio, and some folks think that it's easier than Lucid Chart. But basically the same concept there. You can see we also dropped Visio up there as well. They're both going to be cloud-based programs as long as you are all set up on 365, right? Other items like Tango, Scribe. I know if you're on Facebook at all or any type of social media platform, you've probably seen the Scribe video like 400 times. Look, my boss thinks I'm so productive because I use Scribe. So, so that is another great tool to use. And then of course,
If it didn't show up, it's going to now, all
oh,
of
it
our phones.
is. Oh, for
And
everybody. You guys just wait.
Excellent.
Scribe is going to be all over all of your feeds. I'm sorry, sorry, not sorry. Um, but then you have things like Snagit, so those really cool screenshots that we have, we use a program like Snagit to be able to use those highlighting and arrows and different things like that. So you definitely want to make sure that you're keeping those things up to date. Remember with something like SharePoint, you also get previous versions. So if you're not saving a new document each time, you can also go back and look at previous versions. And there's also collaboration that's involved there as well. So obviously that's going to be our first choice for where you could store that documentation. But things like a shared drive, if you're still in server world, sure, the shared drive would be something that would also be considered. Just make sure you're limiting, who has access to that. And you probably want to at that point keep your Word document or your editable documents in one place that's more secure while you're just putting that PDF out there for users to actually access and use. So we also like to talk about briefly, because there is another webinar out there, how important it is to go through the process of implementing these new workflows, train your staff on what the changes are and what needs to be done differently. Make sure that you're using reports to track that high level data. So things like where do we want to put our agency commission and make sure that commission things are processing through, or are we using the right policy statuses, the right activities? There's a lot of reports that are going to be out there for you to be able to monitor that information, or like Jenny said earlier, monitoring whether or not somebody's workflow is good or bad, or if they're just not using activities properly. So those are the things that you want to report on from a high level, but it is extremely important, I cannot stress this enough, that you put some hands on the data that's actually in Epic. There is no report unless you have BDE or Data Lake for things like whether or not the application is getting completed properly, or whether or not the policy data is what's in the application data. There are a lot, and things like naming conventions. Yes, you could do an attachment report, but it's a lot easier to go in and look at a couple of users, different workflows, and things that they've processed for certain accounts versus trying to look at a bulk data of a report every single time. And there's a lot of information that you're going to get from that versus reports always. Another thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that you're retraining. So once you have processed those audits, and don't forget, give folks a little bit of time to get used to that workflow and those processes before you start the process of auditing. Reports you can start right away because you're going to get instant data there. But as far as the actual account review is concerned, hold off and do that a little bit later. So then you also want to provide probably some refresher trainings. And you may also find that there are some holes in your workflows or some changes that need to be made to your workflows. So that's where I was saying earlier, make sure you're talking to your folks, identify any issues that they're having. But sometimes you may find issues that are consistent across the board. And that's where you want to look at maybe modifying the workflow itself. I had somebody the other day ask me, if we go through this process and we create these standardized workflows, how do we make sure that it works? There is literally only one answer to that, and is you have to hold your people accountable. There is no other way that you can ensure that these workflows are going to be followed other than making sure that you're training, auditing, and holding your users accountable for the work that they are actually doing. Really the only way to do it. I have no other better answers. I wish there was a robot out there that could just magically make sure all of that happened for you, but there's not. So just keep that in mind. It's very important to, manage your change management and then, of course, hold your users accountable. We mentioned this earlier, why audit your data? This is a part of our workflow that we just did recently as well. We want to have accurate reporting. What is the detail that we need to get out of the system, because garbage in is garbage out. I know I sound like a broken record saying that because I've said it so much. Standardizing those workflows. Once you've standardized those workflows, if you put all of this effort into this process, why would you not audit? Why? Because you don't know if anybody's following this process that you've put so much time and effort and energy into, not to mention it's monetary as well. Hours are being paid for. So, if you're going to go through this process, it's totally important that you audit and make sure that everybody's doing everything properly. You also want to make sure that data cleanup is being done. So if you had a bunch of issues with PPEs, or issuing companies or missing data fields, whatever the case is, your reports and audits are going to help you identify whether or not that's being done. Man, I mean, we say it all the time, but that's a really important one. We want to make sure that that documentation is out there. If that documentation is not there and something comes up, there's a claim, we might be in real hot water at that point. So balancing the workload as well. Jenny mentioned that too. Identifying any training opportunities, as we said earlier. And hey, you can also use some of this audit data for performance reviews. So if performance reviews are something that you do in your agency, that's another great way for you to audit and see how your users are doing. Okay. I feel like this last question from our dear friend Kimberly is going to be answered by Jenny in just a minute, because she is a great download person as well as her data. And so, Jenny, I'm going to hand that over to you to finish off that question, and then we'll get everybody wrapped up.
Yeah, Kimberly, you said you got an initial load from a carrier starting to download, and the forms that are sending do not match what was entered in Epic. So I'm assuming like they are sending a BOP and you've entered in a property and a GL. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, or if they're just overwriting your data. So if it's the first case, and you've entered in a property and a GL, there's really nothing you can do. You just have to either error out that property GL if you want to receive the download, and then push the BOP through. To error it out, we usually just use that entered in error / cleanup status. I always like to put a little asterisk in front of the policy number just to let accounting know to not post any commissions to this errored out policy. And then you want to expire it out, send it back to 1900, or at least just flat cancel it for the day. Farm or sent on home and we enter in farm lines, yeah, that's what happens. So you just have to, it's not a perfect system, and it's not standard, so you have to know your carrier and know how they're going to send it, and try and anticipate how they're going to send it. Make a cheat sheet. So if you know that this carrier always sends farm on home, then make a cheat sheet for the users and have them enter a home. But once that application is entered in Epic, you can't attach it. The applications have to match. So you have to error out the one policy and send the download through. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. But yeah,
Sounds so sad about that.
I
Uh,
know it's so sad.
so let's talk
I was
about
at
something
ApplyNet.
fun.
When I
How
was at
can
ApplyNet last year, I stopped somebody from Ivans and I'm like, when are you going to make everybody standardized? And he's like, we're working on it. But
right?
it's going to be years down the road, but
Well, let's talk
yeah.
about more fun things like how Kite Tech can help. So, our consulting team, of course, can help with any of the areas that you see here on the screen. And we would actually love if you would help us out today. So, I know I mentioned the survey earlier, but as a part of our mission to provide the best possible support to our agencies that we serve, we are looking at ways to explore and expand our agency consulting services for clients using Applied Epic. Eva, Epic Virtual Administrator, would provide agencies with dedicated support for managing and optimizing their Applied Epic systems, handling everyday tasks, improving workflows, and freeing up your team to focus on what matters most. So there is going to be a survey at the end of this webinar that will include a few extra questions about that possible Eva service that we are developing. And we'll also be sending a separate email with a short survey in case you have more thoughts that you would like to share later. Your feedback is really so valuable to us, and it helps us shape a wonderful service that would truly meet your needs. Also, some really cool things that are coming up. Make sure you don't miss these webinars. We have an open forum, Ask Us Anything, coming up. So you don't want to miss this. For any of your IT or Epic consulting questions, make sure you register for that one. And everybody wants to know all the things about dashboards. You've got to make sure that you show up for that one. So be on the lookout. You can absolutely sign up here with the QR code, or you can check out our website, and we'll be sending out some emails for these as well. Find us on LinkedIn. It'll be on Facebook. I don't know if we're on TikTok, but Scribe will be. So all right. So thank you guys so much for coming out today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Jenny, for all of your wonderful information. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. We hope everything has been valuable to you as far as the information shared. If you'd like to learn more about our services, here's all of the ways that you can get in touch. We'd be happy to meet with you and learn more about your agency's technology and consulting needs. As we mentioned earlier, you will get the recording. Make sure you follow us on YouTube so you can check us out there too. And we would really appreciate your feedback in the survey today. Thanks, guys, for hanging around. To all of those who are still here, we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.
Bye.